History has branded him with a nickname he never actually carried, a single word that overshadows years of faithfulness, miles of travel, and a death defined by courage. We call him Doubting Thomas, freezing him forever in a singular moment of hesitation. But what if I told you that this same man was actually the first of the disciples to explicitly acknowledge the divinity of Jesus, and the only one brave enough to suggest walking into a death trap when everyone else wanted to run? Welcome to Christian Curiosity. I'm your host, and if you enjoy uncovering the deep human stories behind the figures of the Bible, please subscribe to the channel right now to join us on this journey. The truth is, Thomas was likely the most misunderstood man in the Gospels, and his story doesn't end in a locked room in Jerusalem. It stretches all the way to the coast of India. To understand the man, we first have to look at the mystery of his name. In the lists of the 12 apostles found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he is simply listed as Thomas. But this isn't actually a proper name. It is an Aramaic epithet, Theoma, which translates to the twin. The Gospel of John translates this for Greek readers as Didymus, which again simply means the twin. This naturally begs a question that has puzzled historians and theologians for 2,000 years. Whose twin was he? The Bible remains silent on this. Some ancient traditions suggested he might have physically resembled Jesus, while others posit he had a twin brother or sister who died in childhood, leaving him with a lingering sense of melancholy or incompleteness. But this label of the twin suggests a man who perhaps always defined himself in relation to someone else. A man looking for a connection, a counterpart. Born in Galilee, like most of the disciples, Thomas likely came from a humble background. While Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen, tradition often paints Thomas differently. Because of later legends involving his mission to India, many view him as a builder, a mason, or a carpenter, someone who worked with his hands, measuring reality in stone and wood. This fits his personality perfectly. A builder looks for structural integrity. A builder measures twice and cuts once. A builder wants to see the blueprint before he starts construction. This wasn't a man who lived with his head in the clouds. He was a realist, grounded in the tangible world. His calling to follow Jesus is detailed with a specific drop-your-nets moment in the Gospels, but he was chosen as one of the 12. He lived on the road with Jesus, sleeping under the stars, witnessing the miracles, and listening to the parables. But unlike Peter, who was often impulsive and spoke before he thought, Thomas seems to have been a man of quiet, intense processing. He wasn't afraid of the truth, even if the truth was dark. In fact, the first time we hear Thomas speak clearly in the Gospel of John, he isn't doubting. He is displaying a courage that puts the other disciples to shame. It was near the end of Jesus' ministry. Word had come that their friend Lazarus was sick in Bethany, a town dangerously close to Jerusalem. The disciples were terrified. They reminded Jesus that only recently the religious leaders in that region had tried to stone him. Going back, there was, in their eyes, a suicide mission. They tried to talk Jesus out of it, but Jesus was determined. While the others hesitated, gripped by fear and self-preservation, it was Thomas who spoke up. In John 11:16, he turns to his fellow disciples and says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Think about that for a second. That is not the voice of a skeptic. That is the voice of a soldier. It is the voice of a man who has calculated the cost, accepted the worst-case scenario, and decided that being dead with Jesus is better than being alive without him. It reveals a pessimistic loyalty. He expected disaster. He expected death, but he was willing to march into it. Does that sound like a man who lacked faith? Or does it sound like a man whose faith was stronger than his fear of death? This realism surfaces again in the upper room. During the Last Supper, Jesus is preparing his friends for his departure. He tells them, "And you know the way to where I am going." The room is likely filled with confused nods. The disciples often pretended to understand when they didn't. Not Thomas. He couldn't act on vague instructions. He needed the map. In John 14:5, he interrupts the poetic flow to ask a practical question. "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? It was a blunt, honest admission of ignorance. He refused to fake spiritual insight. And because Thomas asked that question, Jesus gave us one of the most profound statements in all of Scripture. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. We owe that revelation to Thomas's willingness to look foolish and ask for directions. But then came the darkness. The crucifixion shattered Thomas's world. The man he was willing to die for had died, but Thomas wasn't there to die with him. The builder saw the structure of his life collapse. When the news came that the tomb was empty, that Jesus was alive, Thomas wasn't in the room. John 20:24 tells us he was not with the 12 when Jesus came. Why? Was he grieving alone? Was he so heartbroken that he couldn't bear the company of the others? When the disciples found him, bursting with the news, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas pulled back. Put yourself in his shoes. He had seen Jesus broken and buried. Now his friends were talking about ghosts and miracles. For a realist, for a man who deals in facts, this sounded like hysteria born of grief. He drew a line in the sand. Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. This wasn't a refusal to believe. It was a desperate demand for reality. He couldn't base his life on a rumor. He needed to know it was real. He needed to know it was the same Jesus he loved, wounds and all. For a whole week, Thomas lived in the agony of the unknown. 7 days of wondering if his friends were crazy or if he was the one missing out. Then, 8 days later, they were inside again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked. Suddenly, Jesus stood among them. "Peace be with you," he said, and then he turned directly to Thomas. He didn't scold him. He didn't shame him for his questions. He offered him exactly what he needed. "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." In that moment, Thomas didn't need to touch him. Seeing the wounds, seeing that the resurrection hadn't erased the scars of sacrifice, was enough. Thomas falls to his knees and utters the most direct, unequivocal declaration of Christ's divinity found in the Gospels. "My Lord and my God." Not just teacher, not just Messiah, but God. The doubter became the first to fully understand who stood before him. Jesus looked at him and said, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That blessing was for future generations, for us. But Thomas? He was the bridge. His skepticism proved the resurrection wasn't just a vision. It was a physical reality that could withstand the scrutiny of a realist. But his story doesn't end there. In fact, that was just the beginning. After Jesus ascended, the apostles scattered across the globe. Peter went to Rome, Paul crisscrossed the Mediterranean, but tradition says Thomas looked east. He was a traveler who went beyond the Roman Empire into Persia and even further. Ancient sources and powerful local traditions tell us Thomas arrived in India in 52 AD. Can you imagine that journey? Crossing desert trade routes or sailing the Indian Ocean, he landed on the Malabar coast. It was a completely different world, new languages, different gods, a complex culture. Yet, he brought the same message he had verified with his own eyes. There's a fascinating story, maybe a legend, but it captures his spirit. An Indian king named Gandaphoras hired Thomas to build a magnificent palace. The king gave him a huge sum of gold and left on a long trip. When he returned, there was no palace. Thomas had given all the money to the poor and needy. The king was furious and threw him in prison. But Thomas told him, "I have built you a palace, but it is in heaven, not on earth." That night, the king's brother had a vision of a glorious palace in the afterlife, built by the stranger's charity. The king, shaken, released Thomas and finally listened to his message. What's not a legend is the community he left behind. To this day, in Kerala, India, there's a vibrant group known as the St. Thomas Christians. They trace their faith directly back to his arrival nearly 2,000 years ago. That's living proof that the doubter became one of the most effective missionaries in history. taking the gospel further than almost any other apostle. But a message that powerful always faces resistance. After decades of preaching and establishing churches across India, local religious authorities felt threatened. Around 72 AD, near modern-day Chennai, Thomas faced his final trial. The man who once said, "Let us go and die with him," finally did. Tradition says he was speared to death while praying on a hill now known as St. Thomas Mount. He didn't run. He didn't back down. The man who needed to see the wounds of Jesus gave his own body to be wounded for Jesus. His tomb is now under the Sandstone Basilica, one of only 3 in the world built over an apostle's tomb. So, what do we make of Thomas? Do we just remember him for his doubt? That seems unfair. His struggles are our struggles. We live in a world that demands proof. We have moments where God feels silent. Thomas is the patron saint of the realist. He shows us that faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the persistence of searching until you find the truth. Jesus isn't afraid of our hard questions. The great irony of his life is that the man who couldn't believe without seeing traveled thousands of miles to tell people who would never see Jesus that he was alive. He learned his lesson so well that he staked his entire life on it. He went from "unless I see" to "my Lord and my God," from a locked room in Jerusalem to a hillside in India. So next time you feel a shadow of doubt, don't feel guilty. Remember Thomas. His doubt was just the prelude to a conviction so strong it built a church that has outlasted empires. There was another apostle who had a very different reaction to trauma, one who tried to outrun his past and nearly burned out in the process. His story is incredible, but his name often gets lost in the shadow of Paul. You won't want to miss that in the next video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.